let's get this started. Audrey Chang, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. What time is it in Taiwan?
It's 6 in the PM and 3 minutes.
6 p.m. So here it's 11 o'clock in the morning. And we'll register this conversation and have a conversation tonight with Swiss experts to see if we can compare the Taiwanese model with what we have here. But to kick this conversation off, I would like to ask you, what does a digital minister do? Because in Switzerland, we don't have such things.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm in charge of social innovation, open government, and youth engagement, and digital is the instrument, the means to do so. And as the digital minister, basically the idea is that we co-create working with the people, not for the people, so that we can, for example, counter the pandemic with no lockdown, counter the infodemic with no takedown. And this is in thanks to working with the people, because the civic technologists here in Taiwan have more creativity and, frankly speaking, legitimacy compared to the central government. So my work is just to bridge their ideas in a sort of reverse procurement to apply on a societal scale.
Are you the first digital minister that Taiwan has?
Yes, so that's 5 years ago when I first became digital minister. Nobody knows what does it mean to have a digital minister. So I'm asked to write my own job description. And when I did write my own job description, people find it difficult to pass because at a time in 2015, as you know, the SDGs were just ratified. And so I just took a few my favorite SDG targets and say, okay, so as digital minister, my work is just 1717 effective partnerships through 1718 reliable data on 17.6 open innovation. And then the executive yuan, the cabinet people were like, Minister, I don't think our citizens have memorized the SDG vocabulary. You have to explain in plain language. So I translated that into a very short poem, which is my job description. And I'll just read it very quickly. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that a singularity is near, let's always remember the plurality is here. It's a wordplay, actually, because digital 数位 in Mandarin means plural, like many, many. So the idea is to work from singularity to plurality.
Wow, thank you. Was fighting a pandemic also part of your job description?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's all about countering the pandemic with no lockdowns, because we had lockdowns in Taiwan in 2003 and nobody want to go back. So my work has been to work on the 3 pillars. I call them fast, fair, and fun, to ensure that the collective intelligence can very quickly notice the Wuhan report from Dr. Li Wenliao. So on the first day of 2020, we start health inspections. And this is thanks to a pro-social social media called the PTT, which unlike Facebook or Reddit, has no advertisers or shareholders. So it enables people to contribute for the past 25 years now on a purely civic oriented way. It's a civic public infrastructure funded but not controlled by the state through the academic network. I also help, of course, on the live streaming and the toll-free number where anyone can call to report anything that they think we can do better. Like last April, there was a young boy that called saying, you're rationing out mask, which is fine, but all I got was pink ones, which is not fine. All the boys in my class have navy blue mask. I don't want to wear pink to school. So the very next day, at the advice of the participation officer within the Ministry of Health and Welfare, a person dedicated for civic engagement, well, everyone, all the health officer in the daily 2 p.m. press conference were pink. And Minister Chen of Health and Welfare even said Pink Panther was his childhood hero. So overnight, the boy became the most hip boy, and it became very fashionable to start wearing pink masks. So that's also the sort of the communication work that I do.
That's impressive. You have also used a strategy called humor over rumor during the pandemic. Could you tell us more about this?
Definitely. So a twindemic, right? It's not just a pandemic, it's also the infodemic because people feel anxious and there's a lot of disinformation flying around. And so humor over rumor is this very simple idea that when people flag incoming message as spam, like spam reporting, where people already do to an extent on their emails, and we've introduced very similar tools on like instant messaging platforms and so on. So we know at any given time on a public dashboard which virus of the mind are trending, having a higher basic reproduction number. And then we work on the kind of vaccination of the mind, I guess, which is humor. So when we detect, for example, there's rumor about mask use, then a very cute spokes dog actually lives with the participation officer, come out and explain on the right button, wear a mask to protect your own face against your own unwashed hand, which is very funny. And then the physical distance on the top left explained by keeping 3 Shiba Inus away, indoor, and 2 Shiba Inus outdoors, and so on. So basically, by tapping into the memes, the internet meme culture, we create humor that doesn't cost anyone anything. It's not making fun of people, it's making fun with people. And it's not just our counter coronavirus material. Our national dictionary is crowdsourced also under Creative Commons. Our models of the presidential office and many other important buildings are also offered in Creative Commons. And even, well, my lecture like this one tonight is offered in Creative Commons, as well as my portrait. Anyone can visit me, but the transcript is always in the Commons.
Thank you. Could you tell us more about the masks map that you have been working on?
It's last year's work. So last year, as I mentioned, we detected the SARS 2.0, as I call it, on the very first day of 2020. And it became immediately obvious to everyone that the only way that we can counter it without lockdown is to reduce the R number to below 1. And that requires, at that time, the R value was about 3 for the novel coronavirus. So it means that around 75% of people need to have access to medical grade mask and also wear it. And so what we did really is to tap into the more than 100 different tools created by Gov0 or G0V and other civic tech communities using the real-time reported number of the national healthcare, the real-time inventory of masks in each and every pharmacy. So in more than 6,000 pharmacies, which all are connected to the national healthcare network, we publish like a distributed ledger to more than 100 tool makers who can then go and do the interactive map to navigate people to the places that still have masks available, or to chatbots for people who are not that used to maps, or even for people with seeing difficulties, voice assistance, and so on. So within just a couple months, we reached the desired 75% mask coverage, and which is the time that we actually countered not really post-pandemic, postponed the pandemic for more than 10 months with no local confirmed cases.
Thank you. Could you maybe tell us more about how you were involving citizens, for example, with a hackathon, a large nationwide hackathon, I think?
Yeah, definitely. So Gov0 and many other people are a part of what we call the people-public-private partnership, where the people, the social sector, creates the norms and ideas, and the public sector amplifies it. And one particular way of amplifying it is, as you said, through presidential hackathon. And the presidential hackathon is a yearly event. This year it's called Resilient Islands. And each and every proposal need to be corresponding to one or more of the sustainable goals. And every year we run this really a friendly competition, and we use a novel voting method called quadratic voting that invites people to vote in a way that maximizes synergy. And then what happened is that each year we give to the 5 winning teams out of the more than 200 participating each year a trophy. And the trophy is the shape of Taiwan with the micro projector underneath. And then what it does is that when you turn on the micro projector, for example, on the one-stop rescue services, which is a way to introduce into ambulances and hospitals the FHIR protocol that can dispatch such like major trauma patients in a very quick fashion. And then after turning on the microprojector, it will project the president, Tsai Ing-wen, handing you the trophy, promising this excellent idea that one-stop rescue service will be implemented in the next fiscal year with all the budgetary, personnel, and regulation that's required. For example, on the government zero, the air referral and medical care refinement, we actually equipped all the indigenous places, not just the remote islands, to have the video conferencing possibilities for telecare. And we also changed the regulations to enable this kind of electronic exchange of patient data and so on with their consent on the national healthcare platform. And all thanks to this presidential hackathon that accelerated what used to take 4 years or more within the bureaucracy into national priority 5 each year.
This is all very impressive. Thank you so much for sharing, Audrey Tang. But I guess there were also privacy concerns, the fear of surveillance, right? I mean, you're living in a democratic system, so probably citizens were not so sure if they would like to accept these measures. How was that?
Definitely. Well, nobody really said that the mask inventory number have any privacy issues, because I guess masks are fungible. You can't really tell one apart from the other, except for their color, I guess. So nobody has any privacy issues with a real-time inventory being measured by the mask map. But come this year, when we had our real only wave in May, which we again countered in a couple months, we introduced a novel contact tracing method that does have its privacy implications. You see, last year, we largely trust the venue owners to keep a record of people visiting. So if you don't trust the venue, then you leave a pseudonym. Or you just write a Proton Mail email account or some throwaway SMS number. But come this year, it very quickly became apparent that people are not that much willing to gather into the same place to write their check-in details. So we have to invent something digital. And so this is what we came up with. And by we again mean the GovZero initiative. The people on GovZero Slack channel invented this way of keeping the contact tracing data not on any apps and not on any data aggregator, not even in the government, but rather as a kind of post-it note on your local telecom carrier, your phone's carrier. So the way it works is that on your phone's lock screen, you don't even have to download anything or unlock your phone. Just swipe and then point the camera to this QR code, and it sends to the trusted toll-free number 1922, the 15 random digits representing the venue. And so you just click send, that's it. So that's like 2 seconds. And the great thing about this is that there really is no way for the telecom carrier to know what this number means, because the QR code is entirely randomized on a QR code registrar, which is not a telecom. So it's a more secure multi-party arrangement. And anyone can see that when you're sending this SMS, there's a saying on the right bottom corner that says it's for epidemic control use only, which means only licensed contact tracers in the municipalities can take a look at the numbers and piece it together. So we, of course, have transparency reports. It's been around, I think it's 250 million messages that has been deleted. And daily, it's around 18 million deleted. But only so far, since May, there's only 11 million that has been looked upon by the contact tracers. And if within the 28 days, within the data retention period, anyone looked at this record, just like our national healthcare, I can always do a mutual accountability here. So to look at exactly which municipalities, which number contact tracer did look at my whereabouts and which days SMS it is. And so the idea very simply is that it's never used for anything other than contact tracing. And even the 5 telecoms that keeps the data has no way to actually reverse engineer my trails just by my SMS alone, because it's designed in a multi-party way.
And with quarantine, for instance, in Taiwan, I think it's 14 days of quarantine. And then if people move more than 50 meters beyond their houses, they get an automatic SMS. Is that right?
That was last year. But anyway, when we were doing that last year, as opposed to this year, where it's currently mandatory that you go to a quarantine hotel, so it's a physical barrier, not a digital barrier. But last year, yeah, when people before Delta, when people could still quarantine at home, we did use something called a digital fence, which is a SMS again system. And if you don't have a local SMS SIM card, we give you one, even lend you a phone for 14 days. And the idea is that we use triangulation. So instead of GPS or anything that's very fine-grained, it's very coarse-grained. So if your phone moves outside of the quarantine area, then an SMS is sent to you to remind you of the quarantine, that we actually pay you around 100 euros a day to stay within quarantine. If you break out, you will pay us back up to 1,000 actually times more. So maybe you want to keep in the quarantine. So there is a kind of advisory SMS sent this way, but if you don't reply to it or move back to the quarantine place, then the SMS is sent to the local health officers.
Thank you. Do you consider the internet as being dangerous for democracy, or do you think it can be used in a positive way? Because public sphere, as we can see it on Facebook, for instance, is just not working with hate speech and so on. Do you still believe in internet as a positive force?
Well, this is like asking, do you still think that people gathering together is good for democracy, and then pointing to a smoke-filled, addictive, drink-served, very loud nightclub with private bouncers, very dark light, and very loud music, and say, here is proof that deliberative democracy doesn't work. Well, obviously, if you deliberate within a nightclub, it's unlikely that you will produce a Habermas-like conversation. Right. So the point here is not that social media is good or bad. The thing is that whether we have investments into the digital equivalent of the public square, of the Hyde Park, of the local town hall museums, university campus. And as I mentioned, we do have classified the digital public infrastructure as public infrastructure investment since at least 2016. So in addition to things made of concrete, like concrete investment, we actually classify the presidential hackathon, the e-petition platform, participatory budget platform, etc., also as public infrastructure. So the people in Taiwan, of course, they still go to the Facebook. I have nothing against the nightlife district, but they don't go there for participatory budgeting and deliberation.
Thank you. Before opening the floor, and you can also type your questions on Google Meets if you are joining us online. Before opening the floor, I have one more question. You came from outside government, and now you're a minister. How do you think that civil society and governments can work together in a meaningful way?
Well, I'm still working with the government, right? I take no orders, give no orders. So I'm working in a purely facilitative way. And I think that the thing here is that many people are, after the pandemic, of course, are realizing that there are structural issues that are of a global nature. So CO2 doesn't know boundaries between jurisdictions, neither does the coronavirus or the virus of the mind, right? This information. I can go on, but the idea is that we need, just like the counter-spun days, which I personally participated around the turn of century, a global collaboration between the civic technologists and the people who can actually take those ideas and amplify it across jurisdictions. So in my opinion, the public sector's role is just that, is an amplifier, but it should not foreclose possible innovations. When we introduced the QR code-based, SMS-based contact tracing, we didn't say, oh, so you can't use the paper anymore. Rather, we encourage even more social innovation around the use of paper by using a stamp that without refilling ink, you can just stamp your way into the venues, and then in a very non-crowded way, because most of the people use the QR code and so on. So there's always a plural possibility for the civil society, or as I prefer to call it, the social sector, to organize and set the norms and habits. And when they realize that the public sphere is actually constructed along the lines of the norms of the social sector. For example, just before our presidential election, the norm was to publish all the campaign donation expense as open data, so investigative journalism can thrive. And then PTT and many domestic pro-social social media implemented this norm, and then we can then talk to Facebook saying, it's your choice. We don't have a law banning you if you don't publish political and social advertisement in real time as open data. But it's 2019 now, and we have a clear consensus on the social sector. So you will face social sanction if you don't realize the transparency of advertisements, your choice. And then just like any trade negotiations, is always better with the implicit threat of a social sanction. So we became in 2019 one of the first, if not the only, jurisdiction that Facebook actually implemented conforming to local norm transparency system to work with investigative journalists and banning foreign interference by sponsored advertisements.
Thank you so much, Audrey Tang. I would like to open the floor and see if we have questions either digitally or here in the room.
Audrey, thank you very much for sharing your insights. I have two questions. First, what you've done on the digital front is very impressive. Has Taiwan considered sharing this technology with other governments? Of course, other governments would have to want to use this technology first, but if they were to ask Taiwan, would you consider licensing it? The second question is, now we have a huge global surge in demand for semiconductors. There's a shortage everywhere. The fact that TSMC is based in Taiwan has given Taiwan a huge trump card in the geopolitical competition we see these days. As a technology expert, do you see Taiwan building other trump cards in order to protect itself against especially the fight between the US and China?
Thank you. Excellent questions. So yes, of course, we always use especially GPL or AGPL, free as in freedom, in our digital public infrastructure, because its share alike nature keeps sharing, I guess. So when we, for example, in 2015, adopted the AI-powered conversation tool Polis, which is now a public infrastructure in the public sector at polis.gov.tw. We surveyed all sorts of wiki survey tools and then settled on something that could be licensed in Evro GPL. And then we just shared all our translations or improvement to the visualization and so on to the entire world. So if you visit pol.is, you will see actually our contributions also helped, for example, the Canadian consultation, the Bowling Green, Kentucky, USA consultation, I think Alternivet also, and so on, that came after our 2015 visualization of the Uber conversation in Taiwan. The Polis case is actually quite well received around the world, especially because people want to resolve the Uber dilemma. So in 20 okay, here's what people feel as important, and you're free to contribute what you think as important, like passenger liability and so on. And anyone can click agree, and they move towards me if they agree with me, disagree, and then they move away from me. And after a while, they will start proposing their own reflections. And always after 3 weeks, regardless of jurisdiction, this tool produce this agree to disagree divisive ideologies, like whether it's sharing economy or gig economy, but on the things like not undercutting existing taxes, insurance, registration, empowering local temple and churches, social enterprises, everyone agree. So people agree with their neighbors most of the time on most of the points, if given the kind of pro-social social media. And so not only is the software GPL or AGPL, but the data is also open data for independent analysis. I think there's some publications based on our Uber data that resulted in many academic papers. So we're not just open data and open API, but embrace open source components as well, which is, by the way, invented in Seattle, not really a Taiwanese invention. But as I mentioned, this is a global commons anyway. So that's your first question. The second question, I believe that this sort of digital democracy, this way of systematically countering the global structural issues, is one of, I wouldn't call it a trump card, but maybe something that realized what we call Taiwan can help. If we are in ongoing relationship within the democratic polities contributing, for example, not just the US-led Summit for Democracy, which we're also a partner, but we're also working actively on our national action plans in the OGP, the Global Open Government Partnership, and so on. And I believe this way of working very closely with reformers around the world is another way of ensuring that people care about Taiwan's continued democratization. And as the recent visit from the MEPs said, that they see Taiwan as a kind of gold mine where they can continue to work out novel ways to realize democracy instead of kind of democracy on a backslide.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Thank you very much. Sometimes, particularly when we talk about participation in digital technologies used for the democratic process, there's the issue of digital divide. I don't know about the demographics of Taiwan, but it's certainly an issue that comes up in European discussions. How do you make sure that while introducing digital technologies, you stay inclusive to the whole population?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, calling the toll-free number 1922, I'm sure most of Taiwanese citizens and residents is capable of doing that. So it's all about adapting our technology to fit what the society is comfortable doing, instead of asking the society to come to technology. But with that in mind, in Taiwan, broadband is a human right. So anywhere in Taiwan, even on the top of Taiwan, almost 4,000 meters, if you don't have 10 megabits per second, it's my fault, like personally my fault. There's people in quarantine hotel writing me saying, I want to watch live streaming video during my very boring quarantine, but this email took me 4 hours to send because on this particular side of Yangming Mountain, there's no good internet reception of the 5G or 4G towers. Ministry of Promise broadband is human right. I'm suffering human rights violation. And then within a couple of weeks, we made sure that there is a telecom tower near that quarantine place, freshly set up. Of course, by that time, that person is already out of quarantine, but he made a point of driving back, measuring the speed test, posting to social media to hold me accountable. So I think broadband at just 15 euros per month, no limit in usage in charge, is one of the very powerful public infrastructure investments that we've done from the 5G spectrum auction and so on, to especially empower the rural indigenous places to make sure that they enjoy the 5G speeds even before the municipalities do.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Thank you. Okay, it's on. Okay, thank you. In Switzerland, we have very varied discussions about 5G. We have varied discussions about the COVID certificate and stuff like that. And the underlying problem is not that people really have privacy concerns and also health issues with 5G. But the thing is that people have this sort of fear, and we struggle with countering this fear. And I don't even know if countering is the right word to use. Maybe we struggle with somehow taking this fear seriously, or just dealing with it. I don't know how the Taiwanese population reacts to 5G or digital certificates that actually take into account privacy issues really well. But how do you, when you introduce new technology, how do you, let's say, deal with people's fear of new things?
Yeah, it's a great question. As a rule, we do not collect new data or invent new data collection apparatus during the pandemic that doesn't already exist before the pandemic. So the cybersecurity and privacy parameters of the SMS, for example, is already very well understood. The way that we do exposure notification is exactly modeled after the flash flood evacuation or earthquake evacuation warnings. Again, people have lived with that for decades. The National Health Insurance card, a really large infrastructure, was an investment in 2003, right after SARS 1.0. And people are already well used to this idea of a IC-based card that provides mutual accountability and will never be used for anything other than public service. It will not be used to sell advertisement, for example. So basically, the individual building blocks are well understood and robust. And the way that to piece them together, like the mask map with pharmacies or the SMS-based contact tracing with the telecoms, were not my idea. It's not government technology. It's the small-scale technologies already invented by social technologists in a small district or a small town, and then amplified through 1922 or through one of the means that let us know that have zero Slack and so on. And then we amplify what's already figured out and already accepted as a social norm from that municipality on a global scale, while allowing each municipality and city to also customize it. For example, Taipei City rolled out its own QR code scanner, which is entirely fine because everybody understands how QR code works. It's not encrypted info in the QR code. It's just those 15 random digits. Anyone can decode it very carefully and easily. So by making sure that the appealability and accountability are always there within its original social norm, like Lego blocks from well understood blocks of technology, we avoid the pitfall of centralizing decision-making power to a kind of black box that's only understood by a few technological elites in the name of the state of emergency, which we have seen in other jurisdictions around the world. And that's perhaps out of necessity, because in Taiwan, we've never declared a state of emergency. There was no lockdowns. There's no constitutional power for the president to override the parliament. Everything we do need to be pre-approved by budget and regulation and laws from the legislative yuan, our legislature. So we're kind of forced to use only the components that are already known as working.
Thank you. Yes, we have another question here in the front.
Thank you very much, Audrey. I wanted to ask, since I think last week or the week before, Facebook famously rebranded itself as Meta and started talking a lot about the Metaverse. We don't have to get into the Facebook idea of it per se, but I'm curious to hear where you see the opportunities, but also maybe the pitfalls of this accelerating move to virtual and hybrid and more immersive digital interactions for civic engagement and digital democracy. Is this gonna, at the end, this is gonna help, or how can we ensure that this is gonna be useful versus how can we address the dangers that are coming with it?
Yeah, as I mentioned, when we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. That's part of literally my job description. So the point here about shared reality or co-presence It's really about empowering the edge, empowering people closest to the pain, meaning that if people want to arrange their interaction patterns in any which way, then we need to have the Lego blocks like Jitsi, like the open web 3.0 community that brings the necessary code, open source preferably, but at least transparent code, to data, to where we are. And then we can start to interact things on our own basis, as opposed to the, I guess, Facebook approach. I'm not sure about the Meta approach, but certainly the Facebook approach of bringing data to code. So they concentrate the power on code and then ask everyone to dedicate their data on kind of a single buyer market, in which case it's all about centralizing decision-making power. And that will become easily a singularity-oriented vision, because people closest to pain have no way to reconfigure the kind of interaction patterns that they want with people. So this entire re-decentralization, Web 3.0, and so on, are just harkening back to the basic idea of a shared reality based on common ownership and common controllership, stewardship of the kind of data that represents our social interactions.
Well, I thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation with us. A question more on the political institutional side. You are digital minister. Would you advise other country or city or county to have such a minister, to have one responsible person or group of people in charge of the digital matters? Or do we need in any minister digital specialist advising the minister? You see what I mean? Do we need a unified approach, or do we need diversified approach in each minister to have people who understand the stakes and do some good job on the digital issues?
I think these are the same thing, and I will explain. In Taiwan, we have 32 vertical ministries, each with their vertical minister. But around those 32, there's 9 ministers at large, or minister with a portfolio, meaning that we don't have our own ministry, but rather our office are composed of secondments and delegates from each and every of those 32 ministries. So in my portfolio of open government, youth engagement, social innovation, etc., the 32 ministries, around half of them, around 16, send people to my office on a rotating basis. So each time, each ministry only send 1 secondment. So we have the Ministry of Culture, Interior, Education, Communication, Foreign Affairs, but not, say, National Defense. So I know nothing about National Defense. So anyway, the point here is that when those secondments work together in a cross-functional way, it enabled them to then talk to the participation officers within their own ministry, around 100 people or so. So it's like a hub of around 20 people in the cabinet office per se, but each of them connects to the another 24 or so team within each ministry in charge of civic engagement. Altogether, this 100 or so strong staff is in charge of co-creating policies with the people. And the great thing is that they take from the side of the people. When we redesigned the tax filing service in 2017, the breakout groups are facilitated by the participation officers in Ocean Patrol, for example, in Sea Patrol. But when we redesigned the ocean policy to allow for more surfing and amateur fishing and so on, the breakout groups were facilitated by the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Justice. And they have nothing to do with ocean affairs, obviously. But it's precisely because of that, these previously seen as very abstract bureaucrats passionately take a side of citizens, because the Sea Patrol also files tax themselves. The legal or the financial officer also have a hobby of amateur fishing or surfing. So when we work in such a cross-functional way, it brings the best, the most people-facing part of the career public service. And so they realize digitalization as a way that actually cultivates such trustworthy relationships, rather than just pushing forward propaganda or communication or something.
I was wondering, in your ministry, do you have staff who check and stop fake news and propaganda from other countries?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I don't have one single ministry, right? I'm cross-ministerial. But yes, in each and every ministry, there are teams that look at, as I mentioned, the R value, the basic reproduction rate of the currently reported issues, and also offer a timely response, which is even more important. So, for example, what we have designed is a way for people to respond from rumor to clarification on average in 60 minutes, but no more than 2 hours, and with 2 pictures each. And then making sure that each is less than 200 characters. So it may be a response by launching a police conversation, but it could also be a response by looking at a clarifiable rumor and then pushing out a humor over rumor response. For example, this one is from our head of cabinet, Su Zhenchang himself. When there was a rumor that says you will be fined $1 million for perming your hair many times a week, which is obviously not true. The participation officer designed this poster that posts our premier as a young man and says, I may be bald now, but I will not punish people who look like my youth. And then a fine print that says, well, we've introduced this really a label and requirement for hair products, not punishing individual people perming their hair, but a hair blower and the premier, as he looks now, says, if you perm your hair many times a week, it will not damage your bank accounts, but it will damage your hair. Just look at me for what will happen to your hair. And so this is hilarious, like literally hilarious. And this clarification reached far more people than the original disinformation. And then people who laughed about it are vaccinated. They become immune. They no longer share the original conspiracy theory. So this is what I mean by kind of a vaccine of the mind.
Thank you.
So we've briefly talked about the structural questions of how to organize the issue of digitalization best in the public sector, but as a follow-up question, the question of staff, what kind of people are you hiring, where do you find them, and most importantly, how are you retaining them? Because many other nations that try to attract digital talent as well face the issue that it's more lucrative, especially for technical specialists, to work in the private sector, or they might be more interested in academia because they feel that they enjoy more freedom than if they're bound in the public sector. So how do you deal with those challenges?
Yeah, but that's fine. I mean, the people who invented the mask rationing map, they're themselves social entrepreneurs. The people who invent the SMS-based contract tracing method, themselves working in very lucrative private sector jobs or in academia, as you said. In GovZero, there's no shortage of people from the likes of TSMC or MediaTek and so on in our GovZero hackathons. So because we're not concentrating the invention on the GovTech, right? We're just empowering the civic technologists who themselves are social entrepreneurs or people working in the very lucrative private sectors. It's just they donate their cognitive surplus, right? Their spare time, essentially, to create pro-social projects. And then we do a reverse procurement. It's they dictating the steps to make it happen. And we looking at a very open spec, just offer the real-time open data and API required. And that could be done using traditional procurement very easily if the first part, the ideation part, is taken care of by the social sector.
Thank you. Do we have online questions, digital questions? No? Okay. So we have another one here in the room.
So it seems to me from all that we've heard so far from you today that, confirming what we've already known is that Taiwan really is a leader when it comes to digital democracy, civic engagement, all the things you talked about. And I was wondering whether you had any theories on why that is. So what are these sort of key factors, historical, cultural, geopolitical, structural, that seem to enable Taiwan to move faster and probably more efficient on these issues than many other places?
Thank you. Yeah, I think, for example, the reason why we countered the pandemic without going to lockdown was because a very traumatic memory in 2003 about people, jumping to their death in a Hoping hospital on a sudden lockdown and so on. So it's a collective trauma. Anyone above 30 years old, remember how bad lockdowns were. So we don't do that. So similarly, people above 40 years old, I'm exactly 40 years old, so my age or older, still remember the martial law, the white terror, right? The dictatorship days, where we had no other choice but to work with a single party authoritarian government. So any counter spam, counter scam, counter disinformation measure must not involve the censoring of speech, because otherwise people would say, then we'll be rolling back all the democratic progress. We'll be back to the dictatorship days. We will be back to authoritarianism, and authoritarianism would have won, right? So basically, by people keeping a fresh memory of what it works in a non-democratic way and vowing to not do that, we force ourselves to invent a long more democracy when we face the threats to democracy. And so I think that's the historical part. And the other part is that our first presidential election in 1996 is already after the World Web. So when people think about democracy, we naturally use the words of the World Web era of participative, deliberative democracy through hyperlinks and so on, instead of a more traditional, like each person only upload 3 bits per 4 years called voting, way of low bandwidth democracy. But that was because our democratization is already after the internet.
Yes, follow up.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a very quick follow-up question to what you said. So the argument sounds convincing, but what strikes me is that this would also apply to many states in Eastern Europe who became democratic, towards the late 80s, early 90s. And there, at least from what I can tell, I see a lot less sort of digital democracy happening. So there has to be something else, right? It can't just be the memory of non-democratic authoritarian rule that's where that there has to be something else that contributes to Taiwan being for some reason more successful than other places.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are the Estonia or the Spain and Iceland also of the world, but there's also the other jurisdictions of the world. So of course it's not a sufficient condition in and of itself. I would perhaps from a more personal angle, I would also say that Taiwan is always caught between many different cultures. At the moment, we have 20 or so national languages, each of them a very different culture, more than half of which indigenous. And there's always this idea of transculturalism going on, like none of the culture want any of the cultures to become purely dominant. So we agree only on the democratic process as our identity and nothing else, because otherwise identity politics will become quite dangerous. So I often say that, for example, during our marriage equality referenda, people felt very strongly, the different generations felt very differently, very strongly. But thanks to the transcultural examples, we were able to kind of innovate and think of a way that says when 2 same-sex people wed, they only wed as individuals, but their family, their kinship do not. And so this kind of wedding only the bylaws, but none of your in-laws, really is a co-creation thanks to a contribution of some matriarchal indigenous nations and some nations, including the Taiwan nation, where the gender doesn't matter and things like that. So there's multiple reference angles when we're making social co-creation, and only a high bandwidth way of deliberative or at least participatory public sphere can enable this kind of conversation, because otherwise, if you don't do any of this conversation before referenda, then of course the cultures with more people kind of just dominates by definition. So a commitment to a transcultural enabling democratic process, I think, is also part of the reason why Taiwan must invent all sort of democratic process that works on very different timescales.
Thank you. Looking at Switzerland, we are also a small democratic country, and we also need to agree on democratic process as an underlying force of everything, because we have a diversity of languages, of ethnical backgrounds, and so on. What comes to your mind when you look at Switzerland?
Yeah, many people think when we design such democratic processes that we want to be the Switzerland of the Indo-Pacific. So it's actually quite explicitly mentioned. So you're a model for us when we're designing direct and participatory democracy, and also the very deep conversations around, for example, the use of electronic voting and so on that you've had also inform our conversation, so that we will cite your example and then say it's probably wise to only use electronic collecting to collecting signatures, or to do limited participatory budget voting or priority setting as in presidential hackathon, but not voting for people. So this like very nuanced position and so on is supported by the fellow democracies that also want to talk in a very kind of nuanced way, more eclectic way when faced with policy options. So I think we're natural allies in that.
Happy to hear that. Have you been to Switzerland?
Not at the moment, except in virtual reality. But no, I look forward to visit.
You would be very welcome to come after the pandemic, probably. I'm not sure. Do you still have traveling restrictions, or how does that work now?
I think it's fine now. I'm very free to travel, and I look forward really to visit Switzerland, and also as the MEPs just invited me to Brussels, so maybe along the way to Brussels as well.
Yeah, there are direct flights even if we are not part of the EU. Thank you so much, Audrey. Yeah. It was a big pleasure to have you with us. And let's keep in touch, and we hope to have you physically here in Switzerland, or meet you in virtual reality another day.
Yeah, definitely in a shared reality for sure. Right. So thank you for the really good questions. Great questions, really. And till we meet in physical space, I guess, live long and prosper.